Today, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Nazry Bahrawi to speak to us. Dr. Bahrawi is Assistant Professor of Southeast Asian Literature and Culture at University of Washington in Seattle. He's published on racialism, modernism, literary Islam, and translation as cultural rewriting in maritime Southeast Asia in relation to other Indian Ocean cultures. Dr. Bahrawi is an editor-at-large at Wasafiri magazine and the essay and research editor for the Journal of Practice, Research and Tangential Activities, otherwise known as PR&TA. He has also translated Malay literary works to English. Today, Dr. Bahrawi will be giving a talk titled Grime to Shine, the Gentrification of Singapore's Vernacular Literature and Translation. Dr. Bahrawi, please.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Wan Ling, for organizing this very special Singapore Studies series. I'll start by sharing my screen now. I'm just going to go ahead and talk as I go along. My presentation today is based on an article that will be forthcoming in an edited volume that came out of a conference in 2017. As you can see on the left here, that conference is called of Peninsula and Archipelago, the Landscape of Translation in Southeast Asia, that transpired sometime in 2019, organized by the Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. It took about 2 years or so for the entire project to become fixed and to be in its final stages now. So I put on the center and the right hand, right part of the screen, the content page for you to kind of have a look. I guess this information might be useful for other scholars who are thinking about how to turn your presentation into a chapter or journal article later on in your career and stuff like that. All right, so that's the background context of where I'm coming from, and I'll start the presentation proper now. So in mid-October 2013, an unassuming discussion between a reporter and an arts administrator in Singapore, in a Singapore daily, bellies a deeper question, and that question is, how does literature figure in the nation's creative economy? Pointing to the absence of Singaporean authors in the running for international literary prizes, the reporter, whose name is Kenneth Chong, as you can see on the left, raised doubts on whether the National Arts Council, or NAC, was doing enough to promote local works on the global stage. In response, the article you see on the right, the arts administrator, William Fuan, pointed to a slew of programs developed by the Arts House, which is a not-for-profit organization, to promote local literature abroad in partnership with the NAC, expressing hope that Singapore can be a city of literature. While it is unclear if William Fuan was referring to the official UNESCO scheme, it is notable that Singapore's official application to be part of UNESCO Creative Cities Network, or UCCN, just a few years later from when these two pieces were published in 2016, was made on the design ticket rather than the literature ticket. So for any nations to apply for the UCCN, you've got to choose first the master category. And while the debate has been around the idea of literature as a global economy, Singapore in the end decided to apply on the design ticket rather than the literature ticket, as I've just said. So going back to that question, where does literature figure in the nation's creative economy? My presentation will attempt to shed some light on this conundrum by analyzing how Singapore manages literary translation, which is a facet of its literary landscape that had gained some traction since the later part of the 2000s. In her study of state policies concerning arts and culture in post-crisis Singapore, Lily Kong points to a 1985 governmental report written by the nation's Economic Development Board, which recommended that the state develop its arts and cultural sector in pursuit of economic gains, such as enhancing Singapore's appeal, not just as a tourist destination, but also as, quote, a vibrant cultural scene to attract foreign professionals to work and develop their careers here, unquote. A later 2002 governmental report specifies the literary arts as a part of the sector. By the mid-2010s, the term SingLit, short for Singapore literature, has come to unofficially define the works of locally produced literary arts. The NAC, the Stat Board or Statutory Board overseeing the management of the arts in Singapore, provided seed funding for the establishment of SingLit Station in 2016. Another one of the NAC's grant recipient, known as the Singapore Book Council, began organizing events bearing the term SingLit, such as the hashtag Buy SingLit Festival and SingLit Read Our World workshops in partnership with local literary institutions and bookstores. The term appears to cut across different genres such as prose, poetry, and to a lesser extent, theater. Though the SingLit imaginary has gained traction among literary producers and activists, the literary blogger Ruby Tiagarajan points to the futility or the futile exercise of defining the term from the perspectives of production, citizenship, setting, and sensibilities, expressing wariness that it reduces literature to a cultural phenomenon that is, quote, emblematic of the state, as you can see in the paragraph at the bottom there. Literary translation has become a core facet of the SingLit movement. In particular, the NAC has maintained a steady investment in translational projects from the later part of the 2000s. The projects vary in terms of their target languages and forms. It includes the rendition of vernacular works to English and English works to European languages, as well as translation workshops and mentorship programs, among others. For the purposes of this presentation, I am interested to map out the translational map. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm interested to map out the translation of local literary works from Singapore's vernacular languages to English, which is, as most people here know, is the nation's primary language of communication. While there are 3 official vernacular languages in Singapore, my analysis will be trained on works that were originally written in Malay or Bahasa Melayu, Bahasa from this point on, and not those produced in Mandarin or Tamil, which are Singapore's other official vernacular languages. And the reasons are as follows. First, Bahasa occupies a unique position in Singapore as its national language that is no longer as widely used as in the early years of Singapore's independence. As a national language, Bahasa is employed in national ceremonies and the national anthem of Singapore. Its evolution from lingua franca to a minority language as Singapore transitions from a developing to developed nation could garner interesting insights about the nation's management of literary translation in service of the creative economy. Practicality is my second reason for focusing on Bahasa. As a Singaporean Malay who speaks and reads the language, I could presumably garner insights stemming from the content of the work itself in relation to their extra-textual circumstances and context. Relatedly, it is important at this juncture to address my positionality in this research. I enter into it as a practicing literary translator who has received some funding from the NAC to translate Bahasa literary works to English. This means that my analysis cannot be taken as scientific in the sense that I am an objective observer. On the other hand, this also means that I can draw from my experience of that process in pursuit of a constructive analysis. So the next section is titled Sanctioned Dissent. This presentation will begin its investigation by considering the systemic structures of Singapore's literary landscape that supports translation. And here, one of the most important is the Cultural Medallion Prize, institutionalized in 1979, more than a decade after Singapore's independence in 1965. And this is the page from NAC about the Cultural Medallion Prize. Administered by the NAC, the prize is awarded to veteran artists spanning an array of genres, from dance to literature, for their artistic excellence, contribution, and commitment, which have enriched and distinguished Singapore's arts and culture scene, as you can see from paragraph 1. Winners receive a cash award of about $80,000 for them to continue creating works, which includes channeling part of the award to fund literary translation of their publications. For recipients in the literary arts category, the award has been given to writers and poets working in Singapore's 4 official languages since it was introduced in 1979. Garnering information from publicly accessible sources, I have compiled a list of cultural medallion literary arts winners whose vernacular language works have been translated into English. And this is the list here. These are basically 2 tables. The one on the left begins at 1981 and it continues from 2007 to 2013. And as you can see, the list is divided chronologically from the year of award, the recipient's name, the name of the work translated, and the translator or translators of that work. So as you looking at the table, I'll just put in some qualifications to contextualize the list. First, the list outlines a range of literary genres encompassing novels, as well as collections of short stories, poetry, and essays. It does not include the translation of plays and dramatic scripts, which the NAC categorized as works of performing arts. So I'm looking at literary arts, strictly defined differently from performing arts. Second, the list does not include all literary works in the aforementioned genres that I've said above. So, for example, dance and other artistic genre. For instance, it excludes English language recipients whose works may have been translated into Singaporean vernacular languages or other languages. It also excludes vernacular language recipients whose works have not been translated, as well as translation of Singaporean works in any of its official languages by a non-Singaporean publisher. Third, not all the translations in this list were sponsored by monies from the Cultural Medallion Fund. For instance, the translation of Ing Te On Lonely Face, published in 2019 by Balestier Press, was financed by the NAC's presentation and participation grant a year earlier, in 2018. So still, my experience translating Muhammad Latif's Lost Nostalgia has led me to understand that the book was partly financed by the Cultural Medallion Fund. Thus, it is plausible that some English translations of other Singaporean vernacular works were similarly funded from the Cultural Medallion Fund. This is, of course, a conjecture that I cannot confirm. Indeed, works in the Epigram Cultural Medallion series, such as M. Balakrishnan's Flowers at Dawn and Eugene's Death by Perfume, bear the line, quote, published with the support of the National Arts Council Singapore, unquote, on their respective copyright pages. If these were not from the fund, then they were certainly funded by some other NAC-administered grants. Focusing on the Bahasa works on this list, we note a total of 6 works. All of them are part of the Epigram Cultural Medallion series, all of them novels, and the remaining 2 were published by Ethos, that is a short story collection and a poetry collection, both by Muhammad Latif, one of them of which I was involved in. The works came from 3 veteran writers of the Malay Singaporean literary scene, Suratman Markasan, Isa Kamari, and Muhammad Latif Muhammad. While all the works can be considered social critiques, they vary in terms of intensity as works of political criticism. Okay. So thinking about the intensity of works of political criticism of these works that have been kind of put into the list, on one end of the spectrum is Isa Kamari's The Tower, which figures as the least political work on this list. This novel can be described as an allegorical tale of personal success and failure of a famed architect named Ilham, the book's protagonist. who reflects on his life as he slowly climbs up a 101-story building, which he had helped to design in his younger days. As a work of social critique, the novel is not directly about Singapore, as it laments, quotes what a critic writing in Travelfish blog says as the increasing materialism of the world, unquote. A universal issue that could transpire elsewhere, not just in Singapore, could also be in Seattle, for instance. In my article, I outline a specific example that strengthens this claim, but in the interest of time, suffice it to say here that there is little commentary on the protagonist part about the institutional malpractices that may or may not be violation of human rights. The lack of censor of this episode positions the tower on the weak end of the political criticism spectrum. Somewhere at the midpoint of the spectrum lies Suratman's Penghulu. The novel centers on the figure of Pak Sule, a village chief of a tiny southern island off the coast of Singapore, who is forced to move to the main island to live in a high-rise flat as part of the nation's urban development initiatives. The antagonist of this story is Pak Sule's son-in-law, Maidin, who opposes his views. Maidin is a careerist civil servant who attempts to arrest his father-in-law for trespassing when he returns illegally back to his island, but to no avail as Pak Sule mysteriously disappears. It is notable that Maidin becomes a parliamentarian at the end of the novel, posing a subtle jab at the Singapore government's post-independence resettlement plans. In the article, I included an in-depth discussion of this novel and its video adaptation, but in the interest of time, I'll just move on. For now, I want to attend to a more potent work of political criticism that can be situated at the other end of the spectrum, and this is Muhammad Latif's The Widower, a novel that recounts the tale of Pak Karman, a former political prisoner caught up in the throes of mourning his late wife as he begins to lose grip on reality. The novel does not specify the exact nature of the protagonist's political activities that had led him to be detained for a total of 17 years. However, Latif describes the nature of at least one of his protagonist's post-detention protests. That is Pak Karman's revolt against the removal of his deceased wife's organs for donation because of his own belief that this is contrary to his own religion, Islam. Here, Pak Karman's protest seems to take on an air of personal grievance more than a stand against systemic oppression. This was certainly the implication of his daughter's own words. I'll just produce some quotes here, and you can see from the screen. Please, father, don't do crazy things like this. We'll be shamed in front of our schoolmates. Mother has already died. Why are you protesting like this for? Don't do crazy thing, father. This makes you look like you have gone mad. Indeed, the idea that the protagonist is a serial protester seeking personal validation is insinuated in Pak Karman's own train of thoughts at the opening of chapter 9, when he muses, only by rebelling will life have meaning, only by rebelling do I think, and I think because I exist. Despite the imprecision of his protagonist's intentions, at least one reviewer interprets Pak Karman's multifarious revolts as being, quote, directed against the unnamed states, unquote. There are also clues littered throughout the novel suggesting that Pak Karman may not simply be protesting for the sake of protest. While the works of Suratman and Muhammad Latif can be considered literatures of dissent, their political criticisms are symbolic, operating within the gray areas enabled by the workings of literary formal structures such as poetics, plot, and such. I'll start on my next section called True Grime, and I'll just carry on now. That narratives of dissent are even financially backed by the NAC is noteworthy, considering that the Stat Board had withdrawn funding from literary works that it deems to be politically sensitive. This pertains to two highly publicized cases in the later part of the 2010s. And I guess most people here know that the two books that I'm referring to are Sonny Liu's The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai and Jeremy Tiang's State of Emergency. The question to ask here is why the discrepancy between the funding of these works and the critical Malay works that I just mentioned earlier. What accounts for the discrepancy on why official funding can go to the Malay works and not to these two works? From the perspective of extra-textual circumstances, one major difference between the two types of works has to do with the timing of their awards. While Charlie Chan and State of Emergency were convened prizes after their fundings were cut, the Bahasa translated works were written by authors who had received Cultural Medallion Awards conferred onto them. These works were therefore vetted and approved by official actors prior to their translations. Relatedly, these awards were given in recognition of an author's overall contributions to the literary scene. That is to say, the translated works were reproduced for the purpose of heritage preservation more than subject matter. If we consider their contents alone, it would be fair to say that the Bahasa translated works did not go so far as to challenge the authority of political authority. None of the works point directly to real-world persons or specific events, yet it is also the case that at least two of the works cannot be dismissed as having no basis in events that occurred in Singapore. So I'll give you one example, and I will refer to Latif's The Widower. The Widower gestures obliquely to two episodes in Singapore's post-independence history. The first revolves around the figure of Syed Zahari, a Malay Singaporean political detainee who was imprisoned for 17 years, the same number of years as Latif's protagonist, Pak Karman. Yet the similarities can be said to end there, given that The Widower does not dwell into its protagonist's political past. A second incident, which was referred to in The Widower, channels a public debate about a 1973 fatwa prohibiting organ donation for Singaporean Muslims between the academic Syed Hussein Alatas on the left of the screen, who is pro-donation, and the Singapore Mufti at the time, Syed Isa Ismail, on the right side of the screen, who had taken a more conservative position on it. The Fatwa Committee at the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, or MUIS, had only reversed their fatwa later in 2007, when Isa Ismail was still Mufti, I believe, more than a decade after the original Bahasa version of The Widower was published in 1998. So the book at the center of these two individuals is basically the book that Alatas wrote to outline his reasoning for why he is pro-donation. Biarkan buta basically mean let us be blind, or let it be blind, something like that. Yeah. So I would like to make a brief mention of one notable work by and that work is Syed Zahari's bilingual Bahasa and English collection of poems titled Puisi dari Penjara, or Poems from Prison, published in 1973 in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, with the help of the Malay literary figure Usman Awang. This is the original one on the left side of the screen, published in 1973. The book was republished most recently in 2022 to include a new set of bilingual poems by Syed. The new edition was again printed in Malaysia, this time by Pusat Sejarah Rakyat, which is a non-profit archive dedicated to documenting the history of the people's struggles in Malaysia and Singapore. This despite the idea that it would have been apt for a literary text by a Singaporean poet to be published locally in Singapore. Aesthetically, Syed's Puisi is made even more invaluable as a translated text because it is presented as a bilingual book of poems. This makes it similar to another collection of poems titled Sikit-Sikit Lama-Lama Jadi Bukit, published in 2017, edited and translated by Nazry Bahrawi, which features a selection of poems on vanished places and sites in Singapore by established and new Malay poets. Yet, despite the similarities, Syed's Puisi is more than just a piece of literary work. Like Sikit, it can be considered to perform the work of cultural preservation. If the former meaning Sikit lama-lama jadi bukit commemorates physical spaces, puisi addresses Operation Cold Store as a milestone event. The poem positioned it as a dark episode in modern Singapore history, yet the heritage work that it performs will not likely get the backing of official institutions because its subject matter might compromise, quote, the authority of legitimacy of the government and its public institutions, unquote, which was the reason given for why Sonny Liu's graphic novels funding was kind of pulled. While there is no official support for Said's book, it is considerable that the poet is featured in an entry on the website poetry.sg, an online database of Singaporean poets and their works that had received funding from the NEC in its inception in 2015, but it is now fully administered by SingLit Station, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so I'm now going to be talking about my last section, which is how I try to bring everything together to try to think about gentrification as a metaphor. And this section is called Translational Gentrification. The study of a nation's literary translation landscape is essentially an investigation into the workings of patronage and statecraft. Singapore is no exception, as I have maybe partly demonstrated because I didn't give you the full extent of my my essay. Some works receive official support and others do not, seemingly determined by the work's nature and intensity of criticism. This case study can benefit from a metaphorics of translation approach, a mode of interpretation that is particularly suited for unveiling the workings of power. For instance, Laurie Chamberlain's pioneering article on gender and the metaphorics of translation in 1988 makes the case that paternalism is the force behind the insistence on fidelity and originality for translated texts. The question to ask here is, the questions to ask are, what is the force that governs the translational landscape in Singapore, and what metaphor can help us figure this out? The clue can be found in the three Bahasa works backed by the NEC. At the heart of the novels, their respective protagonists appear to be wrestling with the impact of a quintessential Singaporean feature, rapid urbanization. Ilham in Isa Kamari's The Tower struggles with his desire for material success over his inner spirituality. Pak Sule in Penghulu is forced to resettle out of his rural offshore island home, while Pak Karman in The Widower denounces an official modern interpretation of Islam that allows for organ donation. This struggle is symptomatic of the dominant narrative about Singapore's post-independence economic success that had been accomplished in a single generation. Indeed, this very idea is invoked in the title of Lee Kuan Yew's 2000 memoir, From Third World to First, The Singapore Story, 1965 to 2000. As rapid urbanization took hold of the tiny island states, historical places of some heritage worth, such as the Bukit Brown Cemetery, the old National Library building, and the Sungai Road Thieves Market, were reclaimed and repurposed to make way for new roads and residential estates. In life as in art, lamentations of lost locales make gentrification an apt metaphor for Singapore's translational landscape. Traditionally, the term is used to describe a physical phenomenon. The sociologist Ruth Glass, who coined the term in 1964 to describe a rapid process of urban transformation in a district that does not cease until all or most of the original working class occupiers are displaced and the whole social character of the district is changed. Scholars of gentrification after Glass have extended her definition into the sphere of cultural studies. Sharon Zukin's observations about gentrification and its ties to the creative class is pertinent to the case of Singapore's translational landscape. She describes the process as hinging on geographically targeted investments on the parts of private capital and public policymakers. According to Zukin, gentrifiers with more disposable income rather than long-time residents begin renting in a neighborhood, increasing the value of property there to the point of attracting big institutions to do likewise. This in turn leads to new laws and policies, say around zoning and transportation, that are meant to encourage investments and ensure that existing structures do not collapse. Zukin also writes about the impact that the new residents or gentrifiers have on changing tastes. She writes that, quote, they selectively appropriate the most aesthetically appealing elements of the local landscape for their own use and impose their preferred places and practices, unquote. If Singapore's Bahasa text can be likened to an urban district, its translations into English can be seen as a form of gentrification. These translations are the result of a partnership between private capital, which are publishers, and public policy makers, the NAC. If the original text targets vernacular readers of Bahasa who are likely plagued by social issues relevant to Singaporean Malays, their translated English versions are meant to reach a different audience, an English literate reading public whose members have a penchant to consume literature either as a cultural signifier to indicate that they support the SingLit movement, or that they are enlightened cosmopolitans who read widely. This mode of translational gentrification coincides with Sarah Brulet's seminal work on how the UNESCO and its cultural policies towards literature. And this is the work that I'm talking about. In particular, UNESCO's third phase of literary programming is one dedicated to forge partnerships between the private and public sectors in the pursuit of creative economy boosterism. In this phase, which Brulet identifies as UNESCO's contemporary phase, the organization is targeting niche publics whose members are either wealthy aging publics, unlikely to do much for people living in impoverished conditions, or young folks attracted to a sort of hipster localism connected to the cultivation of the creative industry's workforces. In Singapore's case, the Bahasa translated text seem to target a market whose members possess a higher level of disposable income than the ones targeted by the original Bahasa text, specifically the liberal, cosmopolitan, and creative crowd of the nation's middle and upper classes. Yet, how do we account for Bahasa texts that have not been figuratively gentrified? Said Zahari's poesy is a case in point. Zukin argues that gentrification does not always lead to a done deal and can result in failure. If a project is only backed by one or none of the two actors, that is, private capital and public policymakers, then its gentrified status could be stunted. In the case of Singapore's translational landscape, the NAC has demonstrated an aversion to politically sensitive texts and films that refer explicitly to real-world events and figures. Said's poesy certainly qualifies. We've no signs of interest on the part of public policymakers to support it. Said's poesy can be said to have failed as a gentrified translation project. It is better metaphorized as a piece of real estate that cannot be repurposed to suit the gentrified's preferred taste. It is a case of true grime and not sanctioned dissent. Amidst the story of decline on literary programming that Sarah Brulet in her book have painted for us, I think that Said's poesy represents a glimmer of hope that literature can still retain its critical purpose of questioning norms, resisting dogma. While they are not translations, Sonny Liu's Charlie Chan Hock Chai and Jeremy Tiang's State of Emergency also seem to manifest the same potential of literature to question dogma. Finally, it is important to determine the limits of this approach. Does the metaphor of gentrification work equally well for English translations of Mandarin and Tamil literary works from Singapore? This is an important question that can only be answered by translation scholars familiar in these languages and the Singapore context. And it is my hope that others will respond to this call. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.